Guys, we have some breaking news coming to us out of Saudi Arabia. Reportedly, Ukraine and the United States are proposing a 30-day ceasefire to Russia. Now, the details are very sparse on this, but the offer, as Marco Rubio says, the offer is, quote, to stop the shooting. But when asked about the details of this ceasefire deal, it was unclear if it included the sea and air proposal by Ukraine or if it was a full ceasefire across the front line. And Rubio just said yes, not specifying which one it was. They said the offer is to stop the shooting, which is kind of a weird phrase because what's worth pointing out is that this is actually a war technically with not a ton of shooting. Overwhelmingly, it's fought with indirect fire weapons like drones and artillery. But this is a really huge offer. This is the first time we've seen any kind of peace type of proposal from either side that was even remotely realistic. We've seen a bunch of crazy stuff coming out of Russia. Russia'd be like, yeah, there's a ceasefire that we'll do if you put down your weapons and retreat from the contested territories, which of course is indistinguishable from surrender. So you'd have proposals like that, right? Or Zelensky saying, yeah, there's a ceasefire, just pack up your things and leave Ukrainian sovereign territory. But I think the problem is that the joint statement is so light on details. Ukraine is ready to accept a U.S. proposal to enact an immediate interim 30-day ceasefire with Russia. And this essentially the carrot they were offered is the resumption of intelligence sharing and of military assistance. Now, Rubio says, quote, the ball is in the Russians' court, and he will take the offer to Moscow. And he says he hopes the Russians will agree to a ceasefire, but if they don't, Rubio says, well, we'll unfortunately know what the impediment to peace is here, right? And this is really interesting. One of the concerns that Ukraine has repeatedly expressed about this is actually that Russia will use this time to rebuild its forces. And because Russia is capable of generating so much more military, at least human capital into the fight relative to Ukraine, that the additional time Ukraine feels will favor Russia as it prepares larger and larger armed forces for advance. So it's not clear if there are details in this ceasefire that would mitigate that. For example, some sort of withdrawal of troops or some kind of no man's land or some sort of military demilitarized zone. But again, usually ceasefires like this are very, very discreet. They're very simple because they're simply meant to stop the shooting. Now, I think Russia's going to ignore this or accept it and then violate it. That remains to be seen. I suspect if I was Russia, I would probably accept it, and then within about 7 days, I would violate it, and then I would push a big disinformation narrative that it was actually the Ukrainians that violated the ceasefire, since it's been clear to Russia that at least some key decision makers within the White House are heavily influenced by Russian messaging. Elon Musk and President Trump most notably. And one of the things that I talked about actually in the video that was supposed to go live today, that still may go live, is that the adults are in the room here. Marco Rubio, Mike Walls, these are professionals. These are guys who get their information not from Twitter and social media, but they actually receive information from the national security apparatus of the United States. And this is crucial because folks at the CIA, the NSA, the DOD, the State Department, they get together and they sit there and go, okay, what is true and what context do you need to understand the whole picture? And they will sit down with key leaders, particularly folks like the Mike Walls and Marco Rubio. And if they're willing to sit down for just a couple of minutes with these people, they'll explain to them, hey, here's what's Russian propaganda. Here's the things that are true, but here's the extra layers of detail so that you can kind of understand it beyond just the headline. And here's the things that are actually true that you read in the news. And then they'll say, oh, and here over here are the things that aren't going to be in the news because they're obtained through U.S. classified intelligence, whether that's listening to cell phones or insiders inside the Kremlin or Kiev. They're going to sit there and synthesize that information into a single digestible, usually a briefing sheet. And that's what the Marco Rubios and Mike Walzes of the world, that's what they're receiving. And that's one of the reasons people say, oh, they're establishment. Well, no, it's because they're operating from real information. And you see that once those guys are there and once the president himself goes on to focus on some other fucking thing, you see that there's actual progress being made. Now, there's a whole bunch of problems with a ceasefire. One is that the Europeans have said we don't want to see it. We don't want to create any kind of legitimacy around we don't want any legitimacy around the annexation of Ukraine, and creating a ceasefire does that. The problem is, of course, the realities on the ground do count for something. And I think almost every observer at this point agrees that some amount of Ukrainian territory will end up having to stay in Russian hands. With what level of recognition, I'm not sure. But what I think they really want is sort of like the same way the Trump ceasefire in Gaza took effect, which is to say that it was implemented, and sometimes momentum is your own best friend in these kind of deals. So the idea is to say, listen, we're going to give a 30-day ceasefire, and then we're going to try to reach a more sustained negotiation, right? And if the default state is instead of war, it's peace, then that's just, the pressure is off a little bit. And that can be both good and bad, right? Because right now, likely Ukraine has said, listen, we want to see our salient in Kursk continue to remain intact. And Russia will likely refuse this deal, I think, because they feel that they are collapsing Ukraine's pocket in Kursk. This is where they've gone all in, and they want to collapse this before they accept any kind of ceasefire deal. So they don't want to freeze the front lines and allow Ukraine to reinforce their salient in Kursk. And so this sort of conflict, right? This confluence is a really tight spot for Russia to be in, right? Because in negotiations, yielding some, particularly this key gas transit hub, yielding that to the Ukrainians in a final deal, or even worse, having to give up an even larger portion of occupied Ukraine, or rather Russia would have to give up or return a larger portion of occupied Ukraine in order to restore their own territorial integrity. All of these things are pretty fraught questions. So I'm a skeptic that you're going to see Russia actually agree to this. But what I think it will hopefully do is sort of get the administration up to speed on what the rest of us have known for 3 straight years, which is Russia doesn't have a meaningful interest in peace. Their idea of a peace is a Ukrainian defeat, and that they are the problem, not the solution here. And then finally, hopefully, perhaps we can see the White House adopt a more a stronger stance vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin, right? A more coercive, willing to really coerce him with more, whether that's more aid to Ukraine, more sanctions. There's a wide variety of options here, but I'm very curious to see how this plays out. Now, of course, guys, hit that subscribe button. That makes a difference. But also, if you want access to the uncensored combat footage and analysis from the front lines, that is over on combatvetnews.com. You guys can become a member, support the channel. This is why I can cover these kinds of stories. I can criticize just about anybody, and I have on this channel. I'm fully independent, no major media outlet money, no government money, just you guys. So join up and, of course, get access to those twice a week uncensored combat videos. A huge thank you to all of the Colonel tier members that do so already, like James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knutson, Bastian Himling, Brian Kelly, John McCombs, Jay Zola, Henry Roussier. Today's video on Combat Vet News is actually a really intense trench clearing GoPro from allegedly a foreign American volunteer, call sign Doomer. All right, anyway, guys, see you over there. Cheers.